Welcome to Windowing and Rise Time. I am your presenter, Jason Ellison, and I wrote this presentation and the paper that went along with it at DesignCon with Michael Rowlands. I design interconnects for next generation products, such as 112G and 224 products, and Michael does the same thing for the I/O products up in Nashua, New Hampshire. You can use the contact information on the screen to contact us after this presentation with any questions you may have related to this. So what are we doing here today? First, we're going to introduce the topic of windowing. What is windowing and how do you use it? How is it defined in textbooks? At that point, we're going to go into development of something that we came up with called principal rise time and how Windows relates to principal rise time. After that's all finished, we're going to have a couple questions that, as Lori said, we'll open it up to you all for some discussions. So Windows, what are we talking about here? Are we talking about Microsoft Windows? No. Are we talking about windows that are in your house? No. Are we talking about windows that are defined by equations? Yes. So what are these windows? Windows are simply a process of truncating a signal. And so why would you ever want to get rid of some of the signal that you work so hard to collect? Well, it's a common practice to do this to highlight an area of interest in a time domain waveform before you apply a Fourier transform. So let's take a look at one of these windows in action, or several of these windows in action. On the screen, we have a time domain function that may or may not be periodic, but it was sampled. Next, we want to window this before we apply a Fourier transform and center that window around a area of interest. So here's the first example of this, where we have a rectangular function, and this rectangular function is the window. We multiply it by the signal, and we get the windowed signal. So you can see that it sharply removes all of the content outside of the window, and the window is now periodic because it starts and ends in 0, and a periodic function is what you need to apply a Fourier transform. Similarly, we can do this with a triangle window, or a Bartlett as it's also known as. And in this way, we get a similar outcome, except this time, some of the areas that are outside of the point of interest still have content, and this will show up in the spectrum when we apply the Fourier transform. But the Bartlett window also starts and stops at 0. So it again enforces this periodic nature that we need to apply a Fourier transform. Finally, a third window that we'll just take a quick look at is the Blackman window, which again highlights the area of interest, but reduces some of these side, this side content here that we probably don't want. So we haven't really seen any relationship here how windows affect rise time, right? But it's a very common occurrence that a window is available as part of the selection when you're plotting a TDR. And so since windows don't affect rise time, and we only apply them in the frequency domain, why do we have windows as an option when we are applying them to the TDRs like we have shown here in the HFSS options when you are trying to make a TDR plot? Well, windows, again, are something that's supposed to be applied in the time domain. They can't be directly applied to an S parameter, at least per a textbook, right? The textbooks will always just say it's a apply this thing in the time domain. And so when we see something that says we're going to window something that's an S parameter, it's really like a square peg in a round hole. Right? And so we're going to have to figure out how we're going to do this. And the first thing we have to think is, how are we going to take this window function and apply it to an S parameter vector? So the first thing you might think is, well, if I took this window function and I simply took each sample point and I associated a frequency to it, it would look like a bandpass filter. And a bandpass filter really isn't helpful for creating step responses. So that method's not going to work. We have to come up with something that seems to be logical. So what we're going to do is we're first going to enforce symmetry. And when I say symmetry, I mean symmetry around the DC point, and that's what this is. So this equation here shows how you would enforce symmetry if you only have the positive half of the spectrum. Then once we do that, we get a plot that more looks like what's shown on the screen. And when we apply the window to this plot, it starts to make sense. It starts to look like a low pass filter where the window is truncating the high frequency content. And this makes sense because now when we have a low pass filter, we know low pass filters reduce the rise time on signals. So now we're getting somewhere. And I have it shown here in two different ways to try to give the audience a feel for what the window is doing. So on the top, we have the triangle window plotted in magnitude along with an insertion loss and the insertion loss after it's been windowed. And it looks a little strange because we normally look at these things in dB. So that's why I have it in dB below. So in dB, you can see the triangle window doesn't look like a triangle at all, but insertion loss now looks like insertion loss, and you can see what the insertion loss looks like in dB after it's been windowed with the triangle function. So now that we know that we're essentially filtering an S parameter with a window function, we have to say to ourselves, well, what are we actually doing here? And we're using zero phase filters. And they're zero phase because a window is defined entirely as a real function. So it doesn't have phase associated with it, which means it's zero phase. And zero phase filters have the problem that they're immediately non-causal. And this is easily shown by just plotting a step response from the insertion loss we windowed on the last slide. So the step response of that insertion loss is this blue curve, and you can see it's got a 42 picosecond rise time. And once we window it with a triangle function, the rise time does slow down to 51 picoseconds. And you'll also notice that it moves backwards in time. And that's the non-causal effect that windowing is going to have, and so will any zero phase filter. So this is an artifact of windowing. So now we're going to say, okay, we know we can use a window as a filter. And because we're using a window as a filter, it's essentially an excitation. And if we treat it as an excitation, then we can plot the window alone in the time domain, or at least in some numerical domain like I have shown below. So if we were to take the triangle window and give it some values in frequency, take the inverse Fourier transform of it, then integrate over the x-axis, we'll get a step response, and that's what we have shown on the screen. Now the next thing we're going to want to do is somehow assign a rise time to this excitation. So to do that, you would think, well, I'm just going to count how many points are between the 20% mark and the 80% mark, and then I'll get my rise time. And you would be right. That would be a perfectly fine way to do it, except we don't have points that line up with the 20% and the 80% mark. And the first thought might be, well, you're points in time, or your points here aren't lining up because you don't have enough frequency content. Well, if you expand the amount of frequency content, the only thing you're really doing is making the delta t between these 2 points tighter. You're not going to get more points between these two or these two to get your 20 point. And then if you say, well, you just need more points, so just add points with the same frequency spectrum. And again, you're not going to get what you want. Instead, what you're going to get is a longer tailing edge and a longer edge in the front. So what we have to do is interpolate between these points, and then we'll get a fractional amount of points between that. And that's what we're calling the principal rise time. So the fractional amount of points between the 20% mark and the 80% mark is how Michael and I are describing principal rise time. So that's shown here. And in the case of a Bartlett window, the principal rise time is 1.2601 points. Then we could do some things with this. We can, instead of having just arbitrary points as of x of n in our window, we can then assign these points to a frequency vector. And if we do that, then we can get a rise time using the principal rise time and the number of points. So I have some tables shown here to say, okay, if we had a different max frequencies, what would the rising edge of this window be? And you can see you get a nice spread of these different points. Similarly, you can do the reverse, and you can say, I have a desired edge rate. What is the rise time I need for this? So the reason that this is important is because this is where that percentage comes from in the HFSS window. When it says, I'm going to use a Bartlett window and the width is some percent. Well, that some percent has to do with the maximum frequency that the window is taking into account, and it zeroes out everything else. And so you can actually use a some kind of sub content of what your sub frequency vector of what your max frequency is to reduce your rise time to some known value. And to that degree, there's value in that, right? Because when you want to plot things the same way in the time domain as someone else, we want to have the same excitation and the same edge rate. So if we take this idea and we apply it to a bunch of different windows that are available, we get different principal rise times. And then we can make some observations from these different rise times or these different window functions. So first thing that I would do is say, well, what's the min and what's the max, right? And so if we look at the minimum principal rise time, that would be the Welsh function. So the Welsh function in this group gives you the fastest rising edge for a given set of frequency content. Conversely, the Blackman window has the slowest rise time. So Blackman will give you the absolute slowest edge rate for a given frequency vector. And we also should consider what these step functions look like when you are plotting an S-param or plotting an impedance profile or a step response, because you can end up with some artifacts that you may not want in your time domain. And that's why I have this shown here. So the Welsh function does look like it has an overshoot and undershoot, so that I would expect to see some kind of artifact in my time domain when using a Welsh function. Conversely, the Blackman function is very nice and appears to be either critically damped or possibly underdamped, and clearly the triangle function is underdamped. And you can use this equation that I have shown on the screen here to relate the principal rise time to a max frequency to get a given rise time. And this is very useful when trying to determine what you need to do to acquire a specific rise time. So this is where we're going to start with a little discussion here. So again, this is not a textbook concept, right? But it's used in the industry quite frequently. So is it okay to do? You know, if we're using this, we immediately have a non-causal response. So I know that I talk to signal integrity engineers that tell me anything that affects causality completely ruins anything in the time domain. But in my opinion, it gives us a way to communicate where if we're using something for diagnostics or to put a mask around things, and we want to say, I want to have an edge rate that is defined with a given step response that is known, then I think it's a perfectly fine way to do things from a specmanship standpoint. So at this point, if anyone would like to chime in and give me their opinion on, or give the greater group your opinion on if this is okay to do, this would be the time to do it by raising your hand in the go-to meeting menu.
I don't have anyone raising their hand yet, Jason.
Okay, well, I'll wait for a little bit longer. When we were at DesignCon, we actually had a lot of participation, and there were some opinions, and the opinion generally was, if you're doing any kind of channel analysis, this is right out. Like, you should not be applying windows, because once you start to have a non-causal effect in a channel analysis, it's going to ruin things. You know, when I say channel analysis, creating eye patterns, or any kind of real bit error rate analysis. But for plotting impedance, for trying to figure out what's going on in the time domain to try to fix things, or to communicate with a vendor or a customer or other coworkers, we found this. The consensus was that this was indeed okay to do. So if there's nothing else, I'm going to go on to the next discussion point. So preferred windows. So the windows that we chose in this presentation were basically the drop-down options from HFSS. We felt like, well, you know, we should at least include those. And it turns out that another one of these, it's the Hamming and Hanning. There's some version of that that's used in CST. So CST has something that says cosine function when you're plotting your TDR. And that's a Hamming or Hanning with specific coefficients associated with it that aren't defined, at least in the dialog in CST. So when I do windowing, if I'm in HFSS, I typically use the Welsh function. And the reason I use the Welsh function is because it gives me the fastest rising edge with the least amount of artifacts from just converting from frequency to time domain. If I'm using a impedance profile, I like to use the Blackman filter or a rectangular filter with the Nyquist rate point enforced. And I'm going to go over that in the next slide a little bit more. And the reason I like that, it's not because I'm trying to hide features, it's more that I'm trying to avoid overshoots. And I don't want to have a low peak or a high point that's not real, and that I'm making a mistake by trying to fix something that's not really there. So if anyone would like to share what windows they like to use when they're plotting in HFSS, or maybe any of Keysight's tools, that would be a great time to bring it up now. Okay, I guess no one has preferred windows. That's okay. This is kind of a new thing where if you do have a webinar, you actually want people to participate. But it's okay. So let's go on to the third discussion point of causality. So I immediately said that the windowing function makes things non-causal, and that is true. But one thing that it also does that I didn't talk about yet is it removes the effect of the Gibbs phenomenon. That's because it takes away all the high frequency content that was in the S parameters to begin with. So what I have on the screen here is the launch from an impedance profile with no window, and I have one with the Blackman window used before I plotted the TDR. And then I have a third one, which is where I enforce the Nyquist rate point first. And so what that means is the Nyquist rate point is where you would, if you were starting in the time domain, the last point in frequency, when you convert it to the frequency domain, will have a phase of 0, pi, or negative pi. And that just happens. It's just how a Fourier transform works. But when you start in the frequency domain, that doesn't always happen. And a lot of times, if you look at your VNA measurements and you look at your last frequency point, it's going to, in most times, it's going to have a non-zero, non-pi, or negative pi phase for the last point. And so what that causes is something that is called fractional delay. And what fractional delay means, it's similar to what I was referring to before of why we couldn't just increase frequency points to get our 20 and 80 point. And you need to adjust the phase to make it 0, pi, or negative pi to enforce this Nyquist rate point. And that effectively gets rid of this Gibbs phenomenon as well. And you can see that in the chart. But you also notice that there are some non-zero elements after the Nyquist rate point has been enforced, and those are real non-causalities that are there from the measurement itself, like the salt cal did not take care of these points adequately. So my opinion on causality is that while windowing it works and takes out the non-causalities from the Gibbs phenomenon, it also can remove real non-causalities due to overfiltering. And I personally prefer to enforce the Nyquist rate point instead of simply using a window to get rid of this. And I find it to be the best way to get the most out of my S parameters when doing analysis. So I wanted to know if the group has an opinion on if causality is a concern when, or if it's a good thing to do to get rid of this Gibbs phenomenon using a window, if it's useful, or if maybe the Nyquist rate point is your preferred method to get rid of the Gibbs phenomenon. Okay, seeing as there's no comments, we'll just go right to the end. So we could use these windows to create a known rising edge from a given set of S parameters. And it could be very useful, especially when trying to define a specification for a customer or a vendor. And having this principal rise time as a value to create an edge rate makes it very straightforward with arithmetic to create a known rise time, of anything. If you want, you can take your unit interval for your application and say it's one third the unit interval is the rise time I want, and for that rise time I need this window with this maximum frequency, and you're off. You know exactly what you need to do. So that's really the takeaway here. And I'd like to open it up for any questions anyone may have from the presentation.
If anyone has a question, feel free to raise your hand and I'll open up your mic. Or you can type a question in the question box and then I'll relay that on to Jason. And if not, I did attach the slides to the webinar so you can download them and have Jason's contact information. Hold on, Jason, we have one question. So Rohan, you are self-muted if you want to open up your mic.
Hey, hey Jason, can you hear me?
Hi, yes.
Yeah. So I just got a quick question out of curiosity. Have you tried doing this with the Kaiser window?
No, I've only tried the windows that are shown here. Kaiser, that's a good one. I'll write that down to add that to my list of principal rise times.
Yeah, that one's kind of interesting because it allows you to make some trade-offs between the main lobe width and the side lobe area.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for that that pointer.
Yeah, I don't remember. I don't know if it's available on HFSS or not, but since you're doing the investigation, I think it'd be interesting to find out.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, more information is always better for trying to figure out how to plot stuff.
Jason, we have a question from Matt Wright. Do you have algorithm examples for folks who create custom scripts?
Yeah, sure. Send me your email or send me an email and I will give you the code that I use to create this. It's all using the base MATLAB release, so you don't need any toolkits or anything.
I have another question from Omar. Can you repeat your conclusion and summary statement on why windowing is useful?
Yeah, so windowing gives us a way to, well, it really does two things. The first is it can remove the Gibbs phenomenon if that's something that is a hang up when you're communicating time domain functions. And secondly, it gives us a way to use a known edge and a known rise time for an excitation. So when we're communicating between customers or vendors, that we can use the same way to plot an impedance profile, rather than I'm plotting this in ADS, you're plotting it in HFSS, we're getting different answers, or I'm using some tool that my VNA has that goes from S parameters to TDR, and I really don't know what it's doing. So if we are to take these S parameters and instead window them and apply the impedance equation, then we have a common way of doing it, and we should have better lab correlation or simulation correlation, and it gives us a good way to communicate.
Those are the only questions that we have right now, Jason. So I think we can go ahead and conclude the webinar.
All right, thank you everyone for attending. I hope you found this useful.
Thank you, everyone.